Hey everybody, Josh Sigurdson of World Alternative Media here, and of course I'm joined by author and economic analyst here at WAM, John Sneisen, and we are joined once again by the incredibly interesting Rob Kirby of KirbyAnalytics.com. Welcome back, sir.
It's a pleasure to be with you guys.
Now, without further ado, there is so much going on in the world right now, so let's get right down to it. Since we last spoke, Britain has voted to leave the EU, and while it's a step away from globalism, the UK is still in servitude to the central bankers, so there's still business as usual. What are your thoughts on the Brexit vote and what it means long-term for the markets, especially silver and gold?
Well, I view the Brexit vote as a repudiation of globalism. I don't think it's business as usual as it was prior to the vote. And I think that the Brexit vote has set in motion a chain of events which is ultimately going to, at least in my mind, lead to the unraveling of the European Union. So I view this as a victory for humanity and a defeat of sorts, or a major battle lost on the part of the globalists. And why I view this as a victory for humanity is because the globalists have a self-declared agenda which is extremely anti-human and eugenics-based, and they have little regard and in fact have contempt for humanity and want to see many of us, like 90% plus of us, removed from the face of the earth. So
there's no doubt that this is on the agenda, and there's no doubt that this is a huge step away from globalism and a huge victory. But of course, as we both know, the globalists are always a few steps ahead of us, as it seems most of the time. And I always kind of see all these huge impacting events as something that can always be grasped by the globalists in a way and conform to what they eventually want. And an example of that is the fact that a lot of them are talking about creating an EU superstate in the aftermath of Brexit. And while we see a lot of people talking about globalism for the first time, and it's an incredible time to be alive and an incredible time to witness, the globalists always find their way around all of these events and always find a way to better their end goals. So What do you think of this EU superstate idea?
Well, let me respond to it in this way. As the Allied forces and the Russians were closing in on Germany, Hitler was well documented to be in his bunker saying that victory was at hand. And that, you see, these people who are sociopaths and maniacs and megalomaniacs who have grandiose plans of taking over the world, they have ways of getting caught up in their own crap, and I view the hubris that we hear out of these sycophant globalists to sound and have a familiar ring to it, because they say things in history, if they don't repeat, they certainly rhyme, and it seems to me, after this stunning defeat. Understand, the globalists were so cocksure that they had the British vote to stay in the bag. It seems that their claims and their chance of having it in the bag was really quite a bit of hubris. And it seems to me that these same globalists have other fires that are burning. And it's going to be interesting to see how they deal with them, namely the rise of nationalism and populism in America, as it's been manifested with this wide-based populist support for Donald Trump, and that again is just another expression of us, the little people, finally getting it and figuring it out and becoming educated and awakening to the fact that we're being screwed by officialdom on a daily basis.
And there's no doubt a massive divide these days. So it's kind of a bittersweet moment because, of course, the globalists are losing in one respect, but then there's all these internationalist millennials that are standing up and saying, we want globalism, and it's a massive divide. I think that goes for Europe. I think that goes for Canada, the United States. And also going into this, because we're going to touch on this a bit more soon, but Where do you think the silver and gold markets are with this? Because obviously we've seen over the last few weeks and even over the last year period, we've seen a massive hike in gold and silver prices, and a lot of what many of us have been saying for many years is coming true. So I think the strings have been cut. What do you think?
I don't know if they've been cut, but there's certainly been some new developments that have occurred in recent, very, very recent times. Specifically, basically with the beginning of this year, we've seen a massive, massive, massive increase in open interest, particularly as it pertains to silver, and the amount of naked shorting that's been done to keep the price of silver from rising dramatically more than it already has can be clearly seen with the build in open interest on recognized exchanges. And and the real game changer has been the documented fact that China has entered the silver market on the long side, aggressively acquiring physical silver. And this is something that just hasn't been present in the past. And this in my view is going to, if it hasn't already, really created a tipping point where the demand for physical metal will overwhelm the paper shorting suppressive futures play on the part of officialdom.
And of course, the preservation of value behind silver and gold is abundant. And I think that a lot of people are starting to realize that, because there's definitely a heightened interest in silver and gold once again, as it was many years ago, back in the 70s, I think. A lot of people have renewed interest in this precious metal that survived for thousands of years and saved so many people from economic chaos. And of course, it seems like a bit of a revolution.
Yeah, well, I think it's, well, maybe in a sense, maybe it's a revolution. But what people are becoming aware of, and what smart money and big money is becoming aware of, is that while the price of silver is still relatively low compared to where it was 4 or 5 years ago, we have absolute record open interest, and you see, smart people are beginning to realize that the paper promises or the paper contracts that are being sold, supposedly in a fair price discovery venue like COMEX, people are beginning to wake up and realize that the promises that are being sold, the paper does not exist to cover them, and people are really starting to wake up to the notion that this is a wag the dog, it's a Ponzi scheme. And as a result, smart money, or let's just say people like China or entities like China, this is why they've finally stepped up to the plate and they started demanding the real thing. You see, they're not interested in buying and holding and owning futures. They want real metal, and they're stockpiling real metal. And you see, once enough people wake up to the fact that your COMEX futures contracts are not readily convertible into real metal, and once people wake up to the notion that GLD and SLV may not have clear title to the metal they purport to have, backing the shares that they sell, and once people wake up to these notions that metal that's held in vestiges that are traceable back to officialdom, whether it's a J.P. Morgan as a custodian or a Hong Kong Shanghai Bank custodian of these large purported stores of physical precious metal, people don't really know. And if you read the literature on these funds, they don't give any assurances that the metal that's been deposited in their stores are not leased, because they basically are hands off on whether custodians or sub-custodians are playing the game fairly and even-handedly. So there's a reason why when a prospectus is written, it contains ambiguous language. You see, because there does exist ETFs for precious metal in the world, namely Bullion Management Group. They have a precious metals fund or ETF. The initial precious metals ETF on the planet was the Spicer family with the Central Fund of Canada. And if you read through their prospectuses, there's no ambiguous language. And the reason there's no ambiguous language because they're very transparent about what they're doing. And the only reason that the smartest people on the planet, which is what the Hong Kong, Shanghai banks and the JP Morgans certainly have access to, or if not on staff, there's a reason why they include muddy and cloudy and ambiguous language in their documentation. That's because they're up to no good. And we know they're up to no good because we know how much they pay in legal fees and in legal settlements every year. They budget billions for it. So they're in the business of doing crooked things. And where I come from, if you're using ambiguous language in your documentation, you're hiding something. So, and then now ask yourself what they're hiding.
Yeah, and there's so much like that going on. There's a lot of people are up to no good. That's basically the epitome of what the markets are today. And we know we've been talking in the past, John, about the manipulation of the silver and gold price and how much more expensive it should be, or how much higher the price should be if it weren't for the corrective market.
Well, I don't think we've learned from history where always when you give somebody the option to print paper on top of a contract, like as money, when they had gold, precious metals or something back in the currency, almost all the time they took advantage of that and then overprinted it, and that's how these fiat currency people that believe that fiat is great and said that gold failed. No, gold did not fail. It was actually them not staying true to their contract that it was supposed to be, and they have to go away from that in order to keep on their big schemes of printing a whole bunch of money in debt so the government can get bigger and bigger and bigger. And so
I know you've been studying the ESF, Exchange Stabilization Fund, and how the Exchange Stabilization Fund has been manipulating prices. And Mr. Kirby, can you go a little bit into how the ESF has been rigging the price of silver and gold?
Well, they haven't just been rigging the price of silver and gold. If from an historical context, to give a little bit of background, interest rates and gold are tied together at the hip. And if you want to Google the name Lawrence Summers and Gibson's paradox, you can read an academic treatise that was written by Lawrence Summers as a professor of economics at Harvard University back in the 80s. He co-authored a paper with another professor named Robert Barsky, and this treatise on gold and Gibson's paradox basically laid out the idea that interest rates could be basically driven to zero so long as the gold price was held in check. This was the academic thought that Mr. Summers brought to Washington as an undersecretary of Treasury under Robert Rubin when the first Bush administration decided they were going to it wasn't the first Bush administration, it was Clinton's first administration, when they made a decision that they were going to put the pedal to the metal in terms of deficit spending to try and reignite the American economy, which had been suffering from recession, and he was brought in basically to take the academic theory that he had written about in the 80s and to be the implementer, namely by suppressing the gold price while government was ramping up spending. And I mean, there's absolutely no coincidence that that he made it to Washington under at that time with that kind of a background, given the economic background that existed at the time in America. But I mean, so how does the Exchange Stabilization Fund intervene in markets? Well, the Exchange Stabilization Fund was seeded with $2 or $3 billion back in 1934. And that money arose or came from the revaluing of gold that was confiscated from American citizens. Exactly. When it was taken from Americans, and they were given basically $20 an ounce for it in 1934, and then 6 months later, that gold was officially revalued up to $35, and it created a huge windfall. That windfall money was the seed money that put the Exchange Stabilization Fund on the map as the most wealthy, rich financial entity on the planet. You see, the Exchange Stabilization Fund operates in secret. They operate above all laws. They are accountable to nobody. And they are free to deal in any market that they deem fit, whether that is running drugs, whether that's running guns, whether it's murder for hire, whether it's regime change, whether it's human bondage, and they are involved in all of that and more. And these people have been operating, and they also don't produce any financial statements that are credible.
And evidently, the ESF is actually more powerful in many ways than what we know about the Bilderberg Group. Even with the recent leaks of Bilderberg documents, it seems that it's basically the same agenda. And I know, John, you have this 1999 handbook on the ESF that you've been looking through. And even back in 1999, they put forward this idea of creating bail-in regimes long before anyone else was talking about it. I know a lot of people have claimed that the IMF came up with the idea of bail-ins, but long before the IMF was talking about bail-in regimes, the ESF was talking about it, and they do seem evidently above the law.
Yes. Well, in my view, anyway, the ESF, or the people that control it, is the shadow government. But and not coincidentally, the people that control it are the globalists. And you see, the ESF, in my view, which is this covert, secretive arm of the U.S. Treasury, this is the operational entity that does the heavy lifting when markets need to be call it manipulated, arrested, or boosted in the name of national security in terms of maintaining the dollar as the world's reserve currency. And you see, my understanding and research tells me that the relationship works as follows: the ESF is the might, their broker in terms of who executes the orders of the ESF is the New York Federal Reserve, or the Fed. The New York Fed, specifically the New York Fed's trading desk, acts as the prime broker for the Exchange Stabilization Fund. And they disseminate the orders especially where derivatives are concerned. The New York Fed trading desk disseminates the ESF's orders out to the banks in the marketplace that we see, and specifically they deal with five prime American banks to execute their orders. And they happen to be the biggest derivative houses in America, and they are J.P. Morgan Chase, Citibank, Bank of America, Morgan Stanley, and Goldman Sachs. And that's why these banks have been running derivatives positions at one time or another. A couple of them, I think, are down under 50 trillion in notional at the moment, but they've all been at 50 and up to 75 or 80 trillion at one time or another over the past 7 or 8 years. So that is how the ESF exercises control.
Yeah, and the ESF also, it says blatantly in the book, it says that they work very much in cohesion with the IMF and the Federal Reserve, executing different maneuvers in the economy to, of course, their main mission is to stabilize and keep the U.S. Dollar world reserve currency. That's their only reason. And these guys, they believe that they're, central planners. They could just plan whatever they can. They're so high themselves, as you said, they actually believe that they can, but it will eventually crumble down on them. But these guys are just high up there, believing that they could, run the world through communist, manifesto central planning. But it's not going to work. It's going to crumble down on them. But as you said, that this is where their thoughts are, and they're not going to give up on that until it's completely eviscerated everything.
Well, but let's be clear why it doesn't work. the Keynesian-minded people who control the ESF and who control the spigot of money creation, these people have been, are creating and have been creating infinite amounts of money. You see, and when you create infinite amounts of money, if you want to view money as ultimately as demand, because it, money in the hands of people, translates into demand. When you create infinite amounts of demand and you live on a finite planet with finite resources, the two don't mesh.
No, absolutely.
You cannot have infinite demand when you have finite resources and have it be sustainable. You can do it for maybe a period of time, but this is not a sustainable model. You see?
No, manipulation is far from sustainable, and history's proven that through hundreds of different currencies that have been printed out of thin air and manipulated to the point where they inflate or they are completely devalued to zero. And
exactly.
Yeah, and there's been and I looked through it. It's like from the official list that I found, it's 160 currencies that ended up in hyperinflation.
Yeah, and we are actually on the almost at the 1,000th year anniversary of the first paper money in 1024 AD, and you'd wonder, does it really take 1,000 years for us to learn? Or I don't know if they're stupid as much as they are actually really terrible people who are trying to manipulate people and put them into servitude and create an entire world of debt enslavement, basically.
I think they know very well what they're doing. Like, there's always been, move from gold, silver, to paper, and then back again. Like, this is just a history that happens. They do believe that they could, create and use this monetary system to manipulate, and then, of course, get a whole bunch of assets. Like, that's one of the main reasons, they could print money out of thin air and buy assets. And then they become ultra-rich and control things.
And then we end up with this globalist paradigm, which I wanted to get further into right now, which is something we had a little bit of fun with at WAM a few weeks ago. We hit the streets of Winnipeg to ask people if they supported creating a North American Union, and an alarming majority of millennials supported the idea, knowing full well that it would be much like the European Union and that we need to bind our countries together, get rid of the borders, and create one border.
Electorate of
basically an unelected dictatorship, let's say headed in Mexico City or some hypothetical place like that. And it's insane the level of moronic blindness that people have to this, that they use the word unity, you use the word forward and change, and people will fall for it just like that because people have been brainwashed. And this is a divide I was talking about, because of course we had recently the three amigos meet in Canada, in Ottawa. The president of Mexico, President Obama, and Trudeau met, and the president of Mexico pushed this idea of creating a North American Union, much like we saw under Harper before, and with the Bush years. It's been going on for a long time. This whole agenda has been playing out for a very long time, and it seems like they're trying to use a Brexit vote to push forward this idea of a North American Union. So what do you think is a long-term agenda for the NAU, and do you think the globalists will succeed on this one, Mr. Kirby?
I don't think that we're going to have a North American Union, and not necessarily. I know the way these things are pitched to people. You touched on it when you call things initially. The first time I ever heard of the North American Union, I think it was pitched initially as the Peace and Prosperity agreement or arrangement. And when you use words like peace and prosperity, or about being good to Mother Earth, if it's an environmental push, this is the same kind of language that Americans used in the wake of 9/11. When they brought in a thing called the Patriot Act, which is anything but patriotic, because isn't it amazing that the American administration would bring a piece of legislation in called the Patriot Act when today the U.S. military identifies the biggest threat to America and the administration. The biggest threat to America are patriots and returning veterans. So you see, these people are not pro-patriots at all, and there's nothing patriotic about the Patriot Act. The Patriot Act served as a means to harvest civil liberties and human rights. Just like getting rid of things like posse comitatus in the United States, which was a long-standing law in America that the American military couldn't serve or act in the streets of America, or how about the chunk of the Magna Carta, which George W. Bush so famously stripped, which allowed people the right to call a lawyer if they're being held, and the rights to legal representation, or rights to know what they're being charged with. I mean, these are things that have occurred, and these things that have happened are very, very similar to a thing called the enabling laws, which Hitler passed and the Nazi Party in Germany, that they passed during the 1930s, which basically was a shell of justifications for the reign of terror that the Nazis went on, after the onset of the Second World War, and when they started rounding people up. America has put the same laws in place, allowing them to round people up, that Germany did before the Second World War. These laws, and most of these laws have actually been done by executive order, and they haven't even been debated by Congress or the House of the Senate. Or, I mean, like they've been put forward. They've been put forward in bills where congressmen and senators have been told you have to vote for it to know what's in it. I mean, think about that.
It's incredibly disturbing seeing the level of Stockholm syndrome, and it's like dealing with glassy-eyed Jim Jones cultists, where you're trying to tell them something and they don't listen to the logic. They go by the emotional appeal of it. It's kind of like an Edward Bernays tactic, where you say unity and whatever, and they say, I'm all for it. And most of these people, like the same people that are protesting in the street over Brexit, saying we love the EU, but they couldn't name a single member of the EU Parliament, and they don't even know what the EC is. So they obviously have absolutely no idea what the EU does, how they're controlled, what the whole plan is, because they hear the word unity and they say, well, that sounds nice, let's go for that.
But and it goes further than that. The reason why our populace is so ignorant as to what these agendas really are, and we have a media or a mainstream media that does not report news. They're completely captured, and they're reading. They're basically what they are teleprompter readers. Investigative journalism has died, and it's discouraged by all the major networks, because I know people that formerly worked in the mainstream media who thought they had a mandate when they went to work for these institutions. They thought they had a mandate to be real newsmen. Greg Hunter is a name that comes to mind right off the top.
Definitely.
And these people, when they actually try to get their hands dirty and get in and report real news and do investigative journalism, they get fired. And they're run out of town.
Yeah, we've seen so many people like that. Greg Hunter is an excellent example. Incredibly smart guy and a vigilant guy, and as well as people like Amber Lyon from CNN. We've seen so many people like this. Ben Swan used to work for Fox News, and he's now doing his own thing. And a lot of people are getting out of this because even some mainstream news so-called reporters that I've talked to admit that they're actors. They're not journalists. They're not reporters. They're literally just reading what someone else writes. And I know that from stories they've done on me, where you watch it on TV and it's completely dishonest, it's completely out of context. And I talk with the reporter I had originally spoken with, and they say, look, the editors do what they want with it. I do the video, I ask the questions they want me to ask, and they play with it however they'd like. But that is the fact of the matter here. The mainstream media is a propaganda wing of the military-industrial complex.
Exactly.
New,
but that
KGB.
Exactly. What you're saying is exactly true, but you see, but that speaks to why we have ignorant populace, excuse me, and why we have people that don't know what's going on and don't understand that these agendas and these trade pacts, which really aren't trade pacts, because what they really are they're strip mining our sovereignty. Because all of these trade pacts, what they do is they take the power to regulate and to administrate away from representative elected officials and put it in the hands of corporate appointed boards and boards, which are accountable to absolutely nobody, leaving our our parliaments or our congresses, as shells of their former selves that have no recourse with these appointed boards, and give corporations powers to dictate to sovereign entities. And I mean, this in reality is what the essence of what these trade pacts are all about. This is why these trade pacts are negotiated in secret and with no public input, and why they're not debated in Canada's case in the House of Commons. They're not debated. In the U.S. sense, they're not debated in Congress. And but people who've had privy to them after they've been negotiated, elected people who are sworn to secrecy before they're allowed to see it, they say no. They come out and they say no wonder why this was negotiated in secret. If the people were aware of what was in it, they would have said no.
Oh, they would have walked up to Capitol Hill with torches, and that's the thing. We look at things like the ironic, the fact that people call free trade agreements free, and it goes back to like that same thing that you're talking about with the Patriot Act, etc. That it's just gives shiny, nice looking, pretty words to people, and people won't do the research because they're lazy, because people don't care enough to look into things. So they'll go, well, that sounds good. Let's just go with it.
Isn't that what we call Orwellian doublespeak, I think?
I think we are on the animal farm here. So actually, I wanted to move forward because we don't have that much time, but I know that since we last spoke with you, Mr. Kirby, we confronted Canada's Finance Minister, Bill Morneau, on selling off Canada's gold and the creation of a world currency. And he claimed that gold wasn't of value to Canada. He then went to Bilderberg the week after. What do you think of the Finance Minister saying something so incredibly dangerous and stupid?
Well, it doesn't surprise me in the least. I can tell you that it was in 2006. I was at a private dinner in Toronto where Jean Chrétien was a keynote speaker, and I think there were roughly 50 people or so in this private dining room. And he did a Q&A after the dinner, and I got up and asked him the same question about the dishoarding of Canada's sovereign gold stocks. And I asked him, because I think Chrétien, as a finance minister in the early 90s, he was responsible for selling off roughly half of it. So under his tutelage, the finance ministry sold off over 300 metric tons of Canada's sovereign gold. And I asked him, in light of what had transpired, because back in 2006, I think the price of gold had gone from 300 up to 600 or 700 or so. Anyway, it had gone up dramatically. And I asked him if, in retrospect, he thought that was a good idea, and could he offer any insight or comment, about the process or the decision-making process for that to all happen. I can tell you that the man clearly was backpedaling. There was clearly a change of color in his face. And then in his broken English, he said that was a long time ago, and I don't really remember that at all.
That's always the excuse. And when we spoke with Bill Morneau, the way he reacted to the whole thing, anyway, he kind of almost jumped out of his clothes for a second when we asked him about it, and he tried to explain that, this is a long time coming, and it's the appropriate reaction.
I'll tell you what, where I sit. For an ex-prime minister and sitting finance minister at the time when his ministry sold off 300 tons of gold. For him to say that was a long time ago and I don't remember that, that'd be like me saying I don't remember the first girl I ever kissed, or the first woman I married. So it's not credible. It's incredulous that he would make such a statement.
Well, it causes suspicion. It makes us wonder. Well, obviously, the obvious situation here is, yes, these people are arms of the globalist order. They are doing the bidding of
what it does, guys. What it does is it clearly and utterly states what a political football precious metals really are. Okay, and if ever you wanted evidence that how political a football it is, and how zippered their mouths are on anything that occurs with precious metal, that should serve as a very clear beacon as to just how insidious their treatment of precious metals really is.
Yeah, and Canada had, if I'm not mistaken, almost 1,034 tons at one time.
Maybe at one point, but when they made the decision to distort, I think we were 660 metric tons. Yeah.
Yeah, and of course, I don't think the anti-gold people have much to say anymore, because even last September they would say, well, it went down a little bit, so you guys are wrong, because apparently they don't understand that things fluctuate, and it's not going to be a straight up run to the top here. Obviously, it wavers, it fluctuates, especially silver, but obviously in the long run we are watching something historic unfold in front of us, and to say that silver and gold have no value is absolute insanity at this point. That's just basically saying, facts? What facts? I'm going to go on my instinct here, and my instinct is to do the bidding of my globalist leaders and, to tell people that they need to be enslaved by this paper money that always reverts to zero eventually, because it's inevitable, but, that's how we control people.
Well, paper money reverts to its true value of toilet paper, I would say. But the thing here in Canada, we don't even have toilet paper currency anymore. We have polymer, so it's quite useless for any purpose.
And we've seen what happened in Venezuela. Of course, they sold off all their gold not that long ago, and they're not in very good shape right now, and it's quite sad, and it alarms me that people can't look at other countries and realize, well, if that happens to them, it could happen to us, because we have the exact same protocols. We're just maybe not to the exact extreme that Venezuela is yet.
Yeah, so actually going to Venezuela, we have a question for you. What do you think the impact, and we did a video on this where we looked at Obama putting out an executive order against Venezuela as a huge risk factor for the well-being of the United States. Well, they talking about some people that were in the government of Venezuela, but when you look at it higher, there's over 77. When I looked at it, $77 billion that was issued in bonds, both corporate and government bonds in Venezuela. And I believe there's some U.S. banks. I think it is Citibank. Can you tell us a little bit? Do you know a little bit about what's going on there in Venezuela and American banks?
Venezuela, I believe, has issued a whole lot of U.S. dollar debt, or entities within Venezuela have issued a whole lot of U.S. dollar debt, and their currency has collapsed versus the dollar, which means servicing U.S. dollar debt with a I believe it's maybe a boulevard that they, anyway, the Venezuelan currency has turned to tapioca, and that makes servicing U.S. dollar debt very difficult when much of your revenue is coming from the debased currency, and that's the one real danger for any sovereign entity to be issuing bonds in a currency other than their own. To access capital markets, often countries will use the U.S. dollar market or the U.S. Euro bond market because they claim it's so liquid, and and it works great as long as their currency maintains its value against the dollar. But if they run afoul with the American machine, and the American machine or the people that control the capital markets if they start looking upon your currency unfavorably and it tanks versus the dollar, then servicing that U.S. dollar debt can become very difficult and can put you in a position as a debtor where you have to make very unfavorable choices at the behest of creditors, namely U.S. banks. Think about Greece with U.S. dollar debt and companies like Goldman Sachs saying, "Oh, you can't pay your debt. Maybe we'll take one of your Greek islands instead."
Yeah.
Oh, exactly.
So
Yeah.
anyway,
And this should be serving as a warning. Venezuela should serve as a warning, but then again, so should Zimbabwe, so should Suriname, so should Angola, South Sudan, Zimbabwe, Weimar.
Sure.
All these should have served as a warning, but people don't listen. And the biggest warning is yet to come because, of course, I wanted to ask you about this, sir, was the markets are incredibly unstable. Deutsche Bank is on the precipice of completely crashing alongside several other major banks. Inflation rates are skyrocketing all over the world. How long until we finally see the global collapse? It should have happened already, and I feel as though we should just pull the Band-Aid off quickly already.
well, when the timing question is a difficult one to answer. I think we could see some very huge dislocations in our global financial edifice. I think we could see some major dislocations imminently. But I've been feeling that way for quite some time. But it seems to me that the puffs of smoke are becoming more frequent, and they seem to be getting darker. So
A lot of trends analysts make the mistake of putting an exact date on it because, of course, they don't account for the fact that the manipulation is so vast that they can push off something that should have mathematically already happened. And of course, we've been seeing this for a while because the markets should have crashed already, and they have been able to manipulate it enough to push it on for a bit longer. And I feel like it's going to play out however their agenda wants it to play out. But it seems like Deutsche Bank, I mean, how could Deutsche Bank ever be saved? I don't understand how anyone could consider any possibility of saving Deutsche Bank when their derivative exposure is over $75 trillion.
I think it's contracted dramatically. At the time when Deutsche Bank's derivatives book was at $75 trillion, I believe JP Morgan's was roughly the same, or very close to the same. But JP Morgan's book has contracted from that. And actually, at one point, I think the high water mark for JP Morgan's book might have been 82 or 3 trillion, truth be told, but that would have been back 7 or 8 years ago. But in the last 3 years, JP Morgan's book has contracted back down to around the $50 trillion mark. And all that is representative of is the notion that the U.S. Treasury has handed the baton of forcing rates to zero and below. Mm-hmm. The baton was passed to the ECB and the Bank of Japan with their direct purchases on the part of Draghi and the ECB and Abe in Japan with Abenomics. And the result of all that left America as the highest yielding currency in the Western world with positive yields. I mean, and when you consider that the pension industry and the insurance industry globally are mandated to buy sovereign debt with a very goodly percentage of their assets, and then you consider that America is basically the only country left with positive yield at all. The American currency and the American bond market has been the recipient of a flight to yield-starved investors, institutional investors. I mean, would you rather own a 10-year government that pays 130 or 140, or a 10-year German that yields negative? Like, there's no. If you have to own a 10-year bond, and if you're a pension fund manager or an insurance company, like it's not a really difficult choice. While European and Japanese yields were close to American yields, or there was little difference, American bonds might not have been the favored because of the amount they were issuing at the time through their different QE models that they were running back a number of years ago. But now with the baton being passed to the ECB and the Bank of Japan driving their yields to zero and lower, America hasn't had to use the derivatives weapon as much, and as such, the amazing or a huge contraction in the amount of aggregate derivatives outstanding has occurred, and and that's the result of directly the result of actions taken in foreign lands. So.
And we all feel this on our doorstep. We know we know the crash is inevitable, and we know that it's going to happen eventually. We just can't pinpoint exactly when, but this should serve as enough of a warning for people to get prepared and do what they need to do to keep themselves safe, insure themselves. We're not talking investment here. We're not talking let's go invest a whole bunch in gold. We're saying insure yourself with gold, insure yourself with silver, because this crash is happening and it will affect everybody. And it's just about how well off you can be in the long run, because of course we've seen these collapses in the past, but nothing on the scale of what we see today. And I can't see banks like Deutsche Bank, I can't see them surviving through all of this, because obviously they've been extremely poorly mismanaged, or in some respect they've been mismanaged.
Let's not get carried away. Deutsche Bank has been no more carelessly managed or run than a number of big American banks. And the difference between Deutsche Bank and the big American banks is who regulates them. Deutsche Bank is regulated ultimately by a group in Germany called BaFin. BaFin is intensely separate from the political process, and they actually regulate. And back a number of years ago, I think it was 3 or 4 years ago, they raided the offices of Deutsche Bank and head offices. And I know, because I've been told by people who know people in the German government, that what they found, they were absolutely abhorred to find out that Deutsche Bank was doing and engaged in activity that they were. This activity is no different than what J.P. Morgan and Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley, the stuff they're engaged in, except the difference is they're all overseen by the Fed and the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency in America, and American regulators look the other way with American institutions, because these are the institutions that are effectively implementing U.S. monetary policy via derivatives. Okay, so they look the other way, but the German regulator doesn't want a German bank being involved in implementing U.S. monetary policy. So the reality is there's not really a lot of difference between these banks. It's who they answer to is the difference, and German regulators won't have it. Okay, and this also explains why there is, at least in my mind, visible risks between thinking of Germany and America on many issues. Because Germany does not like the idea that a very natural trading partner for them and an historic trading partner for them, like Russia, is subject to the kind of punitive, trade, American sanctions. I mean, these American sanctions have been dictated. Like, if this doesn't seem like a coincidence to you guys, I think it was 6 or 7 days after Volkswagen opened a big engine plant in Russia in defiance of American sanctions, that Volkswagen was found to have an $18 or $20 billion problem with their diesel engines.
Yeah, absolutely. Suddenly they want to deep six.
Do you really believe? Do you really believe that was a coincidence?
No, absolutely not. Whenever a major industry is attacked by the government, we know that there's an agenda behind it. It always has been that way. Same with every time we see a major five-star general resign, or we see people like Conrad Black as a fall guy, and he's sent to jail over something. We always know there's something more to it, because things like that don't happen unless they need to, or unless they need to deep six someone or something in order to continue.
Listen, guys. Nothing happens in a vacuum, and the fact that Deutsche Bank ran into problem with German regulators, probably much to the chagrin of American regulators, who would prefer that these issues not really rear their heads.
Exactly.
What's going on in the back rooms that we don't hear. And we know things do occur, and we also know that our mainstream press, there's no good story that they're willing to not report. So
yeah, absolutely.
There you go.
And on the subject of Volkswagen, and we're going to quickly wrap up, but on the subject of Volkswagen, we saw that the mainstream media was talking about Volkswagen, but at the very same time, people doing tests on Fords, on Chevys, were finding the same issue as they found with Volkswagens, but they weren't talking about that. They only talked about Volkswagen, and obviously there is an agenda behind that. And we find your we find your message valuable, very valuable to our viewers, Mr. Kirby. It's always good talking with you, and we hope to talk with you again, because obviously things are starting to go down right now more than I think ever. I think it's a historic time to be alive, and I think that the more attention that we pay to these issues, the safer we as individuals will be. And I think that people should definitely check out KirbyAnalytics.com. Check out all of his other interviews. He does a lot of interviews. Max Kaiser, Greg Hunter. We very much value his opinions and his views. So thank you, Mr. Kirby. And this is Josh Sigurdson, John Sneisen, signing out from World Alternative Media. Find the truth, be the change.